So thank you everyone for joining us today for the webinar for the CTMC 2016 series. So the topic for today's presentation is writing specific aims. Everyone but our presenter will be muted. This is to prevent feedback during the presentation. We would like the presentation to be interactive and encourage questions. So you can use the request to interact live button, which is, it looks like a hand and it's at the top right of your screen, and you'll be granted the microphone. There's about a 5-second delay from when you're given presenter access to when everyone will be able to hear you and see you if your camera is on. And you can also use the Q&A box, which is also on the top right of your screen, to type questions for the presenter. There's also an event chat box. It looks like a speech bubble just at the top right under the hand button, which contains a link that we'd like you to download for discussion later on in the webinar. If you're interested in CMEs, you must complete an evaluation form, and we'll provide details for that at the end of the webinar. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Robert Silbergleit is a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Michigan. He's co-investigator in the leadership of the Neurological Emergencies Treatment Trials Network, or the NET. And he's also the principal investigator for Rampart, which was a multi-center, large, randomized control clinical trial of paramedic treatment of status epilepticus. And he's also the co-PI of ESET, which is a multi-center, randomized, controlled clinical trial of emergency department treatment of refractory status epilepticus. So Dr. Silbergleit, thank you for joining us today, and you should now be able to speak.
Okay, can you all hear me? Or Sam, can you hear me?
Yes.
Since they can't hear me, okay. Great, well, thank you very much for today about writing specific aims, and I got to say that thanks Sam for that introduction. There's any number of things from that introduction that I would be more expert at than writing specific aims, and I'm not sure what credentials I can promise you for why I should be talking about this, other than to say that I spent about 6 or 7 years on the NINDS NSDK review session, which is the Institute's clinical trials review panel for all clinical trial related grant applications, and having read, my most credential for doing this is having read lots and lots and lots and lots of specific aims pages over many years. And that's mostly the perspective I'll bring as a reviewer. Obviously, I've written a fair number of specific aim pages as well, some of which led to grants that were funded, and many of which led to grants that weren't funded, so I'm not sure that that in itself is a strong credential, but I've written a lot and I've read many, many more. So Jenna, can I have my first slide? Disclosures, I have no disclosures relevant to this talk. Okay, so the objectives here, I actually think this should be one of the shorter seminars in the series. What I'd like to do is spend a bit of time stressing the importance of the specific aims page, which I think is something that everybody would agree on. And I really can't emphasize that enough, and we'll spend a fair amount of time on that. Then we're going to spend a little time talking about what I think are the hardest parts. So there's a lot of things that make writing a really good specific aims page hard, and most of them are obviously going to be project specific, so there's not a lot I can do to help each of you with your own individual specific aims pages, but there are a couple of common things that, unless you think about them, are often missed and can make writing a good page harder. And then I'm going to suggest a structure, sort of a template or a format for specific aims pages that's very general, and that's something that I don't think everybody necessarily agrees on, but I'll pitch you my preferred style, and then use the balance of the time to actually have an open discussion, really answer a lot of questions. And the PDF that Sam said there's a link to is a single PDF with 4 specific games pages in it. If while we're talking or during the conclusions, you can download that. We'll take a few minutes to give everybody a chance to read those 4 pages, and then we're going to have an open discussion about what we like or dislike about those pages in a way that's illustrative. Next slide. Okay, so the importance of the specific games page, as I said, this really can't be understated, and there's at least 3 really good reasons why this is just terribly, terribly important. And the first is that many of the reviewers who vote on your project will only read this. It'll be the only page of your grant application that they review. So if you know how the NINDS, not the NINDS, the whole NIH review panel structure works, it's that there's a panel of maybe 20 people who are on the review panel for that day. The clinical trials panel's sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, depending on how many grant applications there are. And everyone has an equal vote on the panel, but about 4 of those reviewers will be assigned to your grant application. And there will be a primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary reviewer sometimes, or a primary, secondary, tertiary, and a statistical reviewer. And you can be pretty much guaranteed that those 4 people will read your entire grant application from stem to stern, plus or minus the appendix. But they are probably the only 4 people in that room out of the 20 who are going to vote on your grant application that are going to read your application from stem to stern. So typically what will happen, the setup is that the panel moves on to discussion of your grant application, and the primary reviewer will give a long, comprehensive review of your grant application and all the elements of it. The secondary reviewer will add what they think. The third tertiary reviewer will add what they think, and each of those will be shorter. During that discussion, however, I think the most common practice for the other reviewers is on their computer screen now to flip to your grant and sort of peruse it while the discussion is going on. And the page that they will go to peruse it is going to be your specific games page. Everybody's a little different perhaps, but I think that's what everybody does. And then after that, some of them will flip to your figures or to your methods, but most of them will go to your specific games page and be looking at your specific games page and listening to the discussion, and it will be the only page they read. So that's really key. It's got to have all the arguments, everything that's important about your proposal right there, because they'll hear more things, but that's the only part they're going to read. And hopefully your reviewer will like it and will pitch your thing well, but that one page is your only chance to directly pitch your project to the other 16 reviewers. And hopefully, if you do it well, you're going to pitch it in your specific games page better than even a favorable reviewer. So that's really, I think, the most key reason. And like I said, those 4 reviewers will give scores, and generally the panel will all vote between the lowest score that a reviewer gave you and the highest score, but everyone's score is equal. The reviewers don't get more votes than anybody else on the panel. Next slide. Okay, so this person in years past would have needed no introduction, but nowadays I'm not sure everybody knows who this is. This is Will Rogers, and Will Rogers is famously quoted for many, many quotes, but among one of the better known quotes is, next slide, hit the button. You never get a second chance to make a first impression. And that's, homespun wisdom from Will Rogers, but we actually know that that's how most people make decisions. So it's not just that. We now have cognitive neuroscience that tells you that most people, when faced with a decision to make, will make a snap judgment based on their initial exposure, and then spend the rest of their deliberation time, the rest of the time they spend making that decision, finding reasons to justify the decision that they already made in the first 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds. That's just how people are wired. So even the reviewers are only, the reason for your specific aims page being important is that it's the first thing that your reviewers are going to read too. So everybody who looks at, even if they read your whole grant application, are going to read your specific aims page first. Somebody might read the narrative or abstract first. I think that's a minority. I think people all go to the specific aims page first. So that's your first chance to make a first impression. So if you get people hooked and people are excited about your project based on your specific aims page, they'll read the rest of your grant application looking for reasons to support it. If they read your specific aims page and they're bored or they're disinterested or they disagree, they'll spend the rest of the time reading your grant application looking for the reasons to turn it down. So it's really key that you put people in the right frame of mind. You have to get them excited about your project with your specific aims page. It's not just part of the routine, it's the hook. So really, really key importance to the specific aims page. Next slide. Okay, and then the third reason that it's really important, independent of those two, is that it's probably the page of your application that will get read the most often. So when you're a reviewer, at least when I'm a reviewer, and I think this is pretty common, when you start reading the grant app, you've read the specific aims, you're hooked, you're not hooked, you're looking through the rest of it, and then you start reading through these 12 really dense, research strategy pages. And if you get lost and you can't figure out where the hell are we, you're going to flip back to that specific aims page to reorient yourself to what this grant application is supposed to be telling me. So it's really a grounding page. It's a landing page, and you're going to keep referring back to it. It should be how the grant that follows is structured. And that's important for a couple of reasons. So it's, again, just to keep the person on board and keep them following your line of reasoning throughout the whole 12 pages, so they'll use it for that. And then the other thing that it's useful for, and the reason that the reviewer will come back to it, is because after you've done your review and you're writing up your review, if you haven't seen the summary sheets yet, what the summary sheet has is each of the scoring criteria and then a blurb for strengths and weaknesses, and you're supposed to put in little bullet points for what the weaknesses and what the strengths were for each of those scoring criteria. And when you're a reviewer and you want to fill this out, especially, so different reviewers I'm sure do this differently, but I'm looking for an easy way to fill out that review. I've got a lot of reviews to do, and I'm looking for an easy way to fill it out. So what you do is you flip through the grant application and you're looking for, I need to say two things about why this is innovative because I liked it and I want to give two strengths to the innovation section. So I'm looking for something I can just cut and paste where somewhere in the grant application, I figure the applicant, if it's innovative, is going to say this is innovative because A, B, or C, and I can just go and grab it and cut and paste that into my review. So give them that, right? What you'd like to do is make the review. I mean, one of the jobs of your review is to make it, of your grant application, is to make it as easy to review as possible. You want to make the reviewer your friend. You want to make the reviewer's life easy because they'll be in a better mood and they'll give you a better score. So if you can make it easier for the reviewer to review your grant application, that's a big strength. So if I can go back, I might have to search the grant application for those bullets, but if I can just go back to the specific aims page and get a bullet-sized summary of what's significant, what's innovative, and what's strong about their approach, that makes my day. So try to make the reviewer's day. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the hardest parts of writing a good specific aims page. So obviously it's hard just by virtue of the fact that I've said it's so important, and you've got, what you're proposing to do in 5 years worth of work, and you've probably spent a year preparing for your grant application to get ready for it, and you're going to summarize that all on one page, right? So it's inherently hard, and I don't think that you need to, well, I lost my slides. That because Sam, can you see my slides still?
Yes, we can see them.
Great. Well, I can't. that's going to make this tough for me. Okay. So I know what I can do. I can pull up my slides in PowerPoint. So so that's going to be a good reason for it to be tough regardless. But I think that there are two things that, hold on, give me 1 second here. Excuse me. Okay. Thank you. So there's two things that I think are particularly worth talking about, and one is the narrative of the specific games page, and the second is the importance of focus. And let me talk about those individually. Next slide. Good. So narrative, by definition, is a spoken written account of connected events. It's a story. And the specific aims page is supposed to be a narrative. It's supposed to be a story. It should have a flow. It needs to get people interested at the beginning, and it needs to take them on a journey, and it needs to bring them to a resolution. So that's not that different from other things people will tell you about a specific games page, even if it sounds a little different. So next slide. So what a lot of people will tell you, next slide. Jenna? Okay. What a lot of people will tell you is that, the specific aims page is your version of your elevator pitch, right? It's a written version of your elevator pitch. And I think that's right. So is that different than what I'm saying about it being a story? Well, this is the classic elevator pitch structure that they teach salespeople and marketers. It's for your target customer who has some need. I've got a product that is in this category that has this one great thing about it, unlike the others, and this product is different. And that is, in fact, a story. That there's a problem. There's a character, the customer. The customer has a need, a problem. But whoa, there's a solution. There's a hero. And that hero has this power, this benefit, and it's going to beat the competition, and it's going to be uniquely differentiated, and everybody's going to live happily ever after. So to say that it's like an elevator pitch is to say that it's like a story. But I think the story actually is a more useful way to think about it than just the elevator pitch. And this is why. Next slide. So, and I think it's because it's easier to fit that whole page into what is taught in creative writing as the narrative arc, right? So this is the classic narrative arc that every, probably most stories follow, other than a Brian Lynch movie or Kurt Vonnegut story. But all the favorite stories that you follow. So every James Bond movie, every Star Trek the original series episode, all follows the narrative arc in a perfect, easy way. So that if it's 20 minutes after the hour that Captain Kirk is now captured and in trouble, and that he's going to be in a fight, and then he's going to save the day, and you can sort of calculate it out by the time during the show. The narrative arc always starts with an exposition. Here's the problem. Let me explain the situation, and then whoa, there's a complication, which leads to a crisis, and then the hero comes in with a resolution, and then there's an epilogue coming together, a payback for the story. And this really translates directly into what goes into the specific games. So next slide. So the exposition is your background. What is the disease, medical problem that people are suffering with? And there's a situation. There's a need. And then the complication is the challenge. if only we could figure out this one part, if we could address this with a new technology, we'd have an ability. The crisis then is fine. So is your overarching goal. So here's the problem, here's the immediate challenge we're going to try to solve. The overarching goal is the solution as a general strategy that you're going to try to pitch, and then the specific aims is exactly how you're going to do it. That's what the hero will do. And by the way, you're the hero in this, right? So there's got to be a hero in every good story, and you're the hero. And then the thing that often gets missed most of all is that if there's no closure to the story, or if there's no epilogue, if there's no wrap up, then the story is not satisfying. So you need to have your specific aims and how your specific aims are going to lead to a better world, the resolution of this disease, the improvement of life for these patients, the way that medical care is going to be changed. So follow that story. Whoa, you're really anticipating. You're getting ahead of me. Okay. So what's missing in this picture? So the next part is focus. And it's easy to see from this picture that this character is out of focus. So it's easy to see a specific aims page that doesn't really settle on the problem. And so one of the things you need to do is fix the focus, and you need to make sure that your balance on your specific aims themselves are correct. But next slide. Next slide. So even after your specific aims themselves are really honed and well focused, it's really not enough. So that part is actually relatively easy to do. I think you can actually probably not everybody does it, but everybody probably can get their specific aims well focused, and that takes a little bit of work, but I think that's pretty doable. The really hard part comes what's next, because it's always hardest to see the thing that's missing from the picture altogether. Next slide. So one of the things that was missing from this is the big picture, right? So you need to be able to have a focus on your specific aims, but you also need to bring into the picture the impact, the problem, the way that this is going to change the world, and that needs to be in focus too. And at the same time, next slide, there has to be a backstory. So in addition to the big picture and your specific aims, there has to be enough detail provided, even mentioned in the specific aims, to assure people that you've got a specific project, you've got a specific plan, that you're going to be able to be the hero that brings the story together. So you've got all three of these things that you've got to keep in focus. Next slide. And in photography, we would think of that as being the depth of field, that we use our space, we use our camera resources in such a way that it allows us to actually have reasonable focus on the main topic, which is the specific aims, but also keep an appropriate focus on the backstory, the impact, and the details that are going to support that. And that's the really hard part, is to do one page to get all three of those elements together in a way that's useful. So if there's one page that I would suggest that you write and rewrite and do lots of iterations on, if there's one page that you're going to get friends and external reviewers to read for you and give you feedback on, it's the specific aims page. Next slide. So how do you do that? And that was all telling you that was important. There was a little sort of grandiose. The idea is I'm going to try to give you something more solid and specific to use to write your specific aims page at this point. My disclaimer here is that while I think everybody agrees with the stuff that I just said about importance, and most people would probably agree with the importance of story, lots of people might disagree about the right structure for a specific aims page. I have no authority to tell you that what I'm going to tell you is the right way to do a specific aims page. It's how I like it. If you go out and search the web, you will find lots of online presentations from people with various levels of expertise telling you how to write a specific aims page. And I think actually they do tend to follow structure similar to what I'm telling you, but I can't say it's for sure right. It's really just what I like and what some other people like. So that's my disclaimer. And with that being said, let me show you the structure that I like for a specific games page. Next slide. Okay. So I think you can look at the whole page and think about breaking it up into these sort of 4 boxes. And I think of it in a lot of ways, it's like writing an exposition that you were taught in elementary school, where you start general and you narrow down to a focus, and then you give a thesis, and then you give 3 supporting paragraphs to support your thesis, and then you start from that specific finding and broaden out to the general conclusion. And so that's, I think, still true. What I like to think of is maybe that this top box is maybe a quarter of the page. The next box is going to be about a quarter of a page, and then maybe a third of a page, and then the difference left for the conclusion. So let me walk you through each one of these. So next slide. So this follows pretty much what we talked about. So at the very top, if you've got the space for it, I like to put a title, a short, informative title on the specific games page. It's going to be the title of the grant application. It's going to show up elsewhere as well. Typically, I run out of space on my page and I give up the title because it's on the front of the grant application anyway. I assume people have already seen it. But if I've got the space, I like to have it there. Now, one thing I will say about titles is that NIH used to have a very restrictive length on how long grant application titles can be. And that was great because it forced people to focus on a brief, descriptive title. It's a shame that they've now, in the last form change, made it so that you can actually have, I think, almost 200 characters in the title. It used to be 80 or 100. And I think that's a shame. Don't use the long title length. Use a short title, and it doesn't have to say everything about your project. It has to get people interested and describe it. Next slide. So the next paragraph is going to be that introduction I talked about. So that's your introduction, your background. This is your chance to educate your audience about the problem that you're going to be solving. It's going to be mostly identifying the problem, providing the most important knowledge gaps and needs in your area. You don't have to spend a lot of time, usually, talking about why your disease is important. So if you're studying, stroke, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, the movement disorders, any of these horrible neurologic conditions, the audience, the review audience, they know it's a horrible condition. They know it has a big impact. You don't have to spend a lot of time telling people who are brought by the NINDS why stroke is important, or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or anything else like that. You can mention it briefly, but what you really want to tell them is about the specific area that you're going to be studying, why it's such a big problem for patients with this terrible disease, why there are these things that we don't know that if only we knew, we could make the world a better place. And that's what you want to concentrate your background on. What's the gap? What's the need? What's the big problem specifically that you're going to solve? Next slide. The next box is going to be the specific problem that you're going to solve and how your overall project goal, in broad terms, from 30,000 feet, how are you going to solve this problem? And it's not just how are you going to solve this problem, meaning how is the problem going to be solved? It's how are you going to solve this problem, right? So this is your place to introduce an overview of the problem and the solution, but also present an overview of why you or your group are uniquely suited to be the ones who can solve this problem. We have a new technique. We have a new idea that can bridge this, and we're going to apply this idea to that need that I said above, and that's going to be our solution. And don't be that modest. I mean, this is one of these places. It's like promotion, where people are really uncomfortable because to do this right, you have to put yourself out in a in a way that some people are very comfortable with, but I think most of us are uncomfortable with being so self-promotional. And you got to set that aside. This is you can't go and say, well, it'd be okay if I could do it. I'm sort of qualified to do this. That's not going to work in a specific games page. You're the hero. How are you going to solve the problem? And say it in that quarter of a page. You got a quarter of a page to do that. And then the next block, next slide. And then come your actual specific games. So obviously very important to the specific games page, the actual specific games. They should be bulleted and stand out in some way. You want to have not too many. I think that by and large, most grant applications have 3 specific games. I'm certain that that's the mode. And usually that's a pretty good number. People just like 3, seem to expect 3. 2's sometimes a little too few, 4 just a little too many. But 2 can also work, and it is tough for clinical trials because as opposed to a lot of other types of bench research projects, frankly, in a clinical trial, you really got one specific game, right? I mean, you've got the primary outcome of the trial, and that's really your specific game. But a good clinical trial will answer more than just the questions designed primarily to answer. And those secondary aims, secondary outcomes, usually make up your second specific aim. I think that it's a mistake in a clinical trial. Some people have 5 specific secondary outcomes, and they make each secondary outcome into another specific aim. And I think that just waters down your sales pitch. And I think that it works far better to say that 1 is your primary outcome, specific aim. 2 is your secondary aims, your secondary outcomes. And then 3, for me, what works well, and again, this is not all written in stone. I like the 3rd specific aim to be something exploratory or aspirational. This is, what we can do beyond the constraints of what we're going to have the power to do. What are we going to have a chance to learn from this that's really exploratory? And I think that some people will tell you that that's a weak specific aim because it lacks focus and you can't prove it. And there's something to that. But I find that by the time you get to your 3rd, people will give you a little grace on that. And a lot of times you can capture a bunch of things that would be exciting or interesting to the reviewers in a general way in that category. It makes up for that weakness. So that's the general strategy that I like. There are some other things people will tell you about the aims. You don't want to have aims that are sequentially dependent on each other, so that typically the primary outcome and the secondary outcomes are independent but supportive of each other, but you'd like to know either one even if the other one fails. If the secondary aim depends on the first one and the 3rd depends on the second one, then what people will tell you is that it can all fall down like a house of cards. If you don't do this first specific aim well, the whole project falls down. There's no contingency. There's no way to save it at that point. So generally they're not going to be completely independent in a clinical trial, but they should have as much independence as you can provide for them. Then within each of the bullet points, people have different ways of presenting this. Typically, what I like is a conceptual statement of the aim. We aim to discover whether this is true and describe the primary outcome. And then as subtext underneath that, providing a more detailed statement of the hypothesis to be tested and exactly how you're going to word that, or supportive definitions or narrowing of the thing that explains that concept in greater detail. I think that you can get easily lost if you end up with specific aim 1 and under specific aim 1 hypothesis 1A, 1B, 1C. You run into the same problem as having too many aims. So again, you can do that, and sometimes it's appropriate and it needs to be done that way. But I would try to make optimally one hypothesis that goes with that specific aim. Some people put the hypothesis first and then the summary of it. It can all work. I think what needs to be is short, succinct, and incredibly well written. If the specific games page is what you spend most of your time doing, then the aims themselves are what you spend most of your time during the specific games process wordsmithing. And then next slide. And then I think the thing that probably gets dropped out the most often, again, is this bottom paragraph that brings it all together, that explains, again, without necessarily a lot of creativity, why when you do these specific games, you're going to have significance, innovation, and impact. And typically what they'll tell you in the review now, that there's a lot of emphasis. They're striving to get reviewers to concentrate on impact. And what they say is that impact is a combination of significance, innovation, and approach. So significance is the problem you're trying to solve is important, but it has to be an innovative approach and a workable approach in order to have impact. But in this concluding paragraph, I think there's no harm in being as simple as saying, this project will have great impact because of this. It will be very significant because of this, and it's innovative because of this. And those become points that can just be, again, picked up by the reviewer. There's no harm hitting them over the head with it. And if you have presented everything right, it'll gel, and they'll be left with, at the end of that page, move on to something else, holding your impact in their hands. So that's the structure I like. That's about the parts of the page allocations I like. Nothing written in stone about that. Lots of good ways to write specific games pages, but it's nice to have a template. It's nice to know what you expect of yourself, and so that's what I would use. Next slide. So in summary, specific games page is critical. It's challenging, but if you make it tell a story and you spend a lot of time trying to make sure that each of the components is in focus, perhaps using the template to do it, this is something you can do that'll make it so that you can sell your grant application, do your science, and save the world. So you can type in this link, or there's a place on the web page where you can just click on it and it will bring you that PDF. That PDF has 4 specific games pages for us to talk about to just spark some discussion. They're not specific games pages that were selected particularly for any illustrative purpose. They were just 4 that I could get my hands on easily and that people were willing to share. So they can be good, bad, or indifferent, but they're just something to talk about for the remaining 15 minutes.
And again, if you'd like to ask a question or have a comment, you can raise your hand, use the request to interact live button so that we can make you a presenter so that everyone can hear you. You can also use the Q&A box to enter a question. I don't see any questions yet or any requests. Please let me know if you're able to download. If not, I can send you the link as well. So it looks like there's a question from Heather Fullerton. Can you please speak more towards aims pages for early clinical trials? If the aim is safety or dosing, how do you make that interesting and hypothesis driven?
So it can be harder. I think that it's still the story still starts the same, right? It's still there's still a problem to be solved. There's still a crisis. There's still a reason that you're the person who can fill the knowledge gap with your new idea. And then it's just pointing out that the specific aims here are to take the first steps toward this, and you, I mean, showing if it's an early phase study, often it's going to be demonstrating safety, and you're going to say, it's important to show safety, and it should be important to show safety. Usually, people are going to want to see some signal of efficacy, and so it's often going to be safety is aim 1, a signal of efficacy of some kind is going to be maybe aim 2, and then if there are not, this is one of the things that is certainly a personal pet peeve of mine. It's not really about writing specific aims, but it's about early phase trials, and that is that if you think that we know everything else about your early phase trial except the safety and efficacy, I think you're probably wrong, right? There's always a bunch of assumptions and a bunch of things that you don't really know in early phase trials, and we should be using early phase trials to inform lots of other elements of what you're going to need to know when you go into later phase trials. So I think that it actually fits that 1, 2, 3 structure reasonably well. It's a little harder to get people excited about just showing safety, especially if you've got lots of preliminary data showing that it's wildly safe. It's actually easier to get people excited about showing safety for a therapy that's somewhat risky. So it's a little odd in that respect. It's a little backwards perhaps, but I think that that's how I would structure aims for early phase trials, and that's what works for me when I read them. And if there's any other faculty on the call too, this would be great as an open discussion, and I think it'd be great to have other faculty who, if they're listening, who want to join in and answer that question differently, please do.
There's another question about your thoughts on sub-aims within specific aims.
So I think that there's one of the examples in that packet that goes into a lot of sub-hypotheses and sub-aims. I think it's actually one that does that in a fairly nice way if you're going to do that. I personally, my thoughts are, I don't like them. I think that I think it gets too noisy and prevents you from telling a coherent story. You've got 12 pages to expand upon your specific aims, right? So I mean, your specific aim, concentrate on its importance and what the scope is, and you really focus on what you can do. Then you can explain later in your 12 pages. I mean, you're going to unpack all the things, every part of the part that's in your specific aims that have to be unpacked and justified later in your research strategy. I think that trying to get a bunch of sub-aims to be coherent and interesting is hard, and I try to avoid it. It's sometimes necessary, but I would discourage it. And if you're going to do sub-aims, I would do as few as possible. So otherwise, it's just a way of cheating. I know I'm supposed to do 3 specific aims, but I really want to do 8, so I'll do 3 with a bunch of sub-aims. If that's what you're doing, then I would definitely discourage that.
Okay, the next question is Adam DeHavenon. He's asking, could you talk about how on a training K award, one would balance sounding like they have enough command of a technique for an aim, but also need to learn or train more?
No. I don't know the best way to do that. So at NSDK, the Ks all go to another. I mean, at NINDS, all the Ks go to their own study section, and I wasn't on that study section. So I've read lots and lots of grant applications for clinical trials, but I've read very few Ks. And frankly, that's a tough thing to balance that I haven't struggled with. So I have little to say about that. I don't know if any of the other faculty, like I said, might be on and able to join in and comment.
We've got quite a few more coming in. This is great. So the next question, how do reviewers feel when you state there is no data or studies to date on a topic and that the first trial proposed is an RCT? For example, first, no studies on beta blockers, and they propose an RCT as the first step.
So I think that was always a hard sell. So I get a couple of answers to that, I think. So one is that was always a hard sell. Two is that it's a much harder sell right now because one of the recent initiatives that has gone on in peer review and funding in general at NIH has been the rigor and transparency requirements and renewed emphasis upon those. And those have largely been interpreted as looking for preliminary, especially in the clinical trial setting, preliminary preclinical data to support a clinical trial. I think that is perhaps an oversimplification of what the rigor and transparency is really supposed to be about. And I think there are times when it is appropriate to study, the notion of clinical research and research in general should be finding the right methodology to study the right question. And there are certain questions where there's not good animal models, or it's a comparative effectiveness thing that is looking at a fairly operational type medical issue that's not going to be simulated in any other way. And the first step to do some comparisons might be a clinical trial. If that's the case, then you just have to explain why. You have to explain why there's why that's the place that you should start, and it shouldn't just be because if I'm right in my hypothesis, I'll get to the answer quicker, right? So it's something I could study in animal models, but that's not what I do. I do clinical trials, so I'm just going to do this. If it looks like you're cutting corners or jumping steps that would actually be useful, then I think that's a problem. Another solution, though, that I think is probably scientifically correct sometimes is to say that there are some things that I can study in this area with animal models, but I don't know where to focus it yet. And actually, an early phase clinical trial might give me the information that I need to go back and do the most effective preclinical work as well. And one of the things that experienced investigators, I think, understand in a way that's sometimes lost early in your career is that the sort of progression of translation is a one-way street from preclinical or observational to early phase to late phase clinical trials, as if it's a monolithic pathway in one direction, is probably wrong. I mean, what we need to do is acquire data. I mean, acquire some data preclinically, some observationally, and some trials, and then we use that data to go back and inform the earlier phase work and iterate in order to get to a solution. And so you can explain that sometimes, that this is part of an early phase exploration that will also include perhaps observational studies or animal work.
So in defense of the beta blocker study, there was a statement that trials had been done a number of years ago which showed reduced mortality from a different beta blocker, but there hadn't been early studies looking at it after myocardial complications. So that's a little different than doing a randomized controlled trial when there hasn't been other work in the area. However, and we've talked about this some in terms of the early phase designs from Chris and Roger, proof of concept, what you're trying to show in an early phase trial. I think you have to do something that's appropriate for the situation. But if you're looking at a new treatment, some form of clinical trial is potentially justifiable. But as Robert points out, you need to have the right sort of biological plausibility and rigor and preclinical evidence if it's possible. Obviously, there are some things for which there aren't adequate animal models, but there are a lot of things for which there are.
I agree.
There's an additional question. When you design an aim to examine the preliminary efficacy of an intervention, how do you make the aim to explore the mechanism of the intervention non-contingent?
Non-contingent upon. So it can't. That's what I was sort of saying is. I mean, I'm not sure I understand what the question is. Obviously, the aims are somewhat contingent upon each other, right? If I mean, there's a contingency in efficacy and safety, depending on how you define it. But especially in neurologic trials, where maybe a functional outcome is often going to be your primary efficacy outcome, that sort of incorporates safety usually. Or at least is somewhat contingent upon it. So I don't think you can separate them entirely. I think you explain to the best degree you can why it's a separate question. And the whole thing doesn't necessarily fall apart if you can show safety without the efficacy or efficacy without the safety, for example. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but I think that there's ways of doing it.
I think
I'm sorry, go ahead, Will.
I think the idea there is that there are certain mechanistic things that may be prerequisites for the intervention to work. Like if it's a matter of, is the drug hitting the target, is it doing these things? I think the question is related to, if you're supposed to show some preliminary efficacy on one aim, how do you know that the mechanistics, if the mechanistic stuff is tied to that and there is no efficacy, then what have you learned? And I think one of the things that one has to be careful about is, if it's a small trial and you're trying to learn about mechanism in concert with the potential for effect, you have to be careful that you're not sort of doing a underpowered phase 3 trial as your exploratory phase trial. So I think thinking of aims that are complementary, they can have some interdependence, but not, if you think of it that way, you could think of it by the sort of converse. If you show that the mechanistic, if you find that there is absolutely no chance of an effect on your primary aim, and the mechanistic stuff is confirmatory of that you see that it's not hitting the target and it's not changing anything, then you have learned something that is important and that this is totally not working. But there are possible scenarios where what you're learning mechanistically may give you insights into how the treatment should be adjusted, or if you're looking at various dosages of things, if things are changing along the mechanism pathway. I don't know. Anything?
Yeah, no, I agree. That's a sort of different question. I mean, there's probably a whole separate lecture in signals of efficacy, and what that means. So that's. I wasn't sure that was the question. If that's the question, I agree with everything that Will just said. The signal of efficacy doesn't have to be the same primary outcome of efficacy that you're going to use later in a trial. I mean, it could be a surrogate, and it could be especially a mechanistic surrogate that you think is a necessary condition to showing efficacy. So if you hypothesize that something causes, less bleeding and intracranial hemorrhage, then showing that there's a reduction in the size of the hematoma could be a surrogate measure. It's not really in and of itself the efficacy measure that we'd want to use in a late phase clinical trial. But if that's the way that you think that your therapy works and it doesn't do that, and that's something that might be easier to measure as a surrogate of efficacy.
Were there any additional questions?
Okay.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you're interested in CMEs, please go to the evaluation form. Push in just a moment for you to be able to see that. Next webinar is on May 27th, Friday, May 27th at noon. And the topic will be rigor and transparency, how to use preclinical data to inform trials. So we look forward to that and seeing you then.
Thank you all very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.